We are continuing to look at the elements of organizational structure. In our previous video, we looked at work specialization and departmentalization, and then our second video, we looked at chain of command. In this video, we're going to look at span of control. So bear with me while I go forward in our slides here. So we talk about span of control. We're talking about the number of employees who a manager manages. That is, how many employees or subordinates report to you. How many people are you responsible for? If you're higher in the organization, then likely your span of control is quite narrow. So if you're in a role that has many unstructured problems, so we don't have clear solutions, then we are going to have to do a lot of complex problem solving. We're going to have to come up with novel solutions. And so therefore our ability to manage people is going to be a lot more narrow. We're not going to be able to handle a large number of people and these unstructured problems. So the higher you are up in the organization, the smaller your span of control. Now, depending on the type of organization you have, you may have quite a large span of control. So call centers, for example, we have one person manning a room full of people on the phones. So you might be responsible for, say, 50 customer service reps. Or if we're in manufacturing, you might have 40 workers on the production floor that you are responsible for. So how do we determine then what's the appropriate span of control? Well, the current trend is to go wider in terms of the span of control because that makes the cost to run the organization go down. It also means that you have more centralization, right? So if we think about how this looks, let me just draw here. So when we have a narrow span of control, so each person here is only responsible for like 2 people, we need a lot of managers. Okay. But if we have a wide span of control, then we need a lot less in terms of middle management and bureaucracy. So it can be cost saving to have a wider span. It can also mean faster decision making because we're more centralized in that decision making as well. So the trend right now is to have more subordinates rather than less. So how do you decide how many people should report to you? Well, what's the level of training or skill of your employees? The more trained they are, the larger or wider the span of control can be. So when you have experts, so if we're managing a bunch of engineers, a bunch of technical experts, they're all doing their own thing. They know what their responsibilities are, and they can work alone with a lot of autonomy, which means that we can have one manager manage much more people. So the more trained, the larger the span. Now, if you have workers that are doing very similar tasks, so we're on that production line at Cargill, we're each just shaving and cutting off pieces of the meat that shouldn't be included, very similar roles, that means there's not a lot of different and complex problems we have to deal with. Everybody goes through the same thing. We can manage much more people, so a much larger span. If the tasks are complex, so each worker has all these unstructured problems, unique issues, then you have a much smaller span. Then you need just a handful of people reporting to you when we're dealing with complex issues because you're going to need to be involved in helping to solve each of those complex tasks, or they may be coming to you more often because of the challenges of the work they're doing. We also have to think about the physical proximity of employees. That should say employees, not employers. Okay. Are your employees close together or far away from each other? So do you have people working remotely? Or are they all like the call center right in the room with you? If you have people that are all in close proximity of each other, it's much easier to deal with problems. And when one worker has an issue, you can deal with it because you can deal with it that all the other employees might be having the same issue, right? You could call out to the group and say, if anyone's having this, here's what to do. You're solving not just the one person's problem, but the whole group as well. So think about like in a class. We teach class, one student has a question. We think that everyone in the room might have a similar question. The instructor calls out the question and the answer. So there we can have a much larger span. One instructor responsible for a class of 40. If your people are all remote though, so we're doing virtual, then it's much more difficult to answer one question for everyone. We then have to do a lot of one-on-one. So physical proximity of employees, if they're far apart from each other, we need a much narrower span. Less people reporting to the single manager. How standardized are your procedures? So is there a general process that everyone follows? The more standardized the process, if everyone works through the same steps, then we can have a larger span. Because again, it's about how much time it takes for the manager to deal with issues with each employee and what is reasonable in terms of their workload. So if it's more standardized processes, then each worker doesn't need the manager to intervene to help as often, and we can have a much larger span. How sophisticated is the management information system? So if we're looking at how we share information, if there's the structure there that anyone who needs information can go into the system and get it, you don't have to talk to someone who has to talk to someone else, then you can have a much larger span in terms of the number of people reporting to you. If there is strength in terms of the organization's value system, so everyone clearly knows what's expected of them, then you can have a much larger span. If the expectations are not clear, then you need more monitoring by the manager of the subordinates, and it's going to be a much smaller group that the manager can handle. If the manager's style matches that of what the employees want, then you can have a much larger span there as well. So a number of these factors influence how many people one manager can have reporting to them. Now, if we have an issue where we have high risk or where there's an emergency, then we need to recognize that in stressful conditions, that manager is going to have tunnel vision. So when you are stressed, you can't see the full 180 degrees. Your vision gets much more narrowed, and you have auditory exclusion. You don't hear everything that's happening around you. So if it is a stressful situation, you need a much smaller span. ICS is an incident command system. It is used in the cases of emergencies. So incident command systems is what we use, for example, when it comes to dealing with natural disasters. ICS has been used with the Horizon oil well spill, 9/11, wildfires in Fort McMurray, planning for the Winter Games or the visit from the Queen. It's a way to manage events when there is that high risk or that sense of emergency. And so notice here the incident command structure has 7 people reporting to command. And then from there might be people reporting to that person or people reporting to this person. So you never have more than 7 people reporting to you at any time. And that's because of that very limited in terms of the auditory and the visual during stressful situations. So your span is limited to 7. So give an example of this. So let's suppose you arrive at a car crash on the highway. You are the incident commander because you were the first on the scene. So as other people stop, your job in terms of this emergency is to appoint tasks. So perhaps you appoint someone to be liaison, and they're going to talk with EMS and the police to make sure that the appropriate individuals are contacted. Maybe you need a safety officer, someone who is going to stop the rest of the traffic and make sure that the traffic is diverted away from the incident. If it's a big issue that's ongoing, you may have an information officer, someone who's going to talk to the press or update the public. If we think about when there's a hurricane, when there's a wildfire, right? We see people on the news. These are the information officers giving an update as to the response and the resources that are being put towards the event. So you are the commander. You will have an information officer, a liaison, and a safety officer if you need them. Okay. And then you'll have an operations manager. This is the doer. So at our car accident, we're going to need someone to check on the individuals in the crash. We're going to need a planner, someone who's going to coordinate in terms of what we're going to need. So how long is it going to take to deal with this incident? Is this an issue where it is minus 40 Celsius and so we're concerned about people being out in the elements, so we need to keep them warm? What are we going to need as this activity spans over time? And then we have a logistics officer who is going to be in charge of getting those materials that we are going to need. So perhaps we are going to need a warming tent. Perhaps we are going to need additional ambulances. So making sure the supplies are there. And then in an event, somebody's got to pay for all those people and all those materials. And so we have someone on the finance and admin side to manage that aspect. Now, if it's a big car accident, a multi-vehicle accident, or if it's like the Horizon oil well spill where you have 20,000 people working on it, you still only have 7 people under you if you're the incident commander. And if you're in charge of operations, there are 7 people under you. And so then it continues. So under operations might be a person who's focusing on one aspect of the event. At the car crash, we might have one person checking on this vehicle. We might have another person checking on that vehicle. Well, they could have people underneath them to help them in the operation. But again, each person only has 7 people that is reporting to them. Okay. So we'll talk more about incident command structures in operations. There's also opportunities at Red Deer Polytechnic to get your ICS 100 and 200 level certifications. So if you are at Red Deer Polytechnic, check out the opportunity for that. To get certified, it's Canada-wide recognition for this designation, ICS 100 and 200. That helps you through this process of how do you plan and coordinate events, particularly when they are emergencies. And so we have to make decisions quickly. And part of that is limiting the span of control.